All right, boys and germs, welcome to the Daily Crack today from, excuse me for covering the camera, from one of my newer locations. Don't worry, I'm inside my 10k bubble. I just decided to travel a bit. Whether that was last night or this morning, doesn't fucking really matter. Anyway, the crack. Usual story, if you're watching this live, hashtag live in the comments. If you're watching this later on, hashtag later on. So today we're going to talk about inflammation, and I'll do my best to explain it in the best way I know, and feel free, if I fuck this up, to comment back in the comments or advise me better in the comments. But common questions I get asked, particularly one today about, inflammation in the body and where it comes from and how it affects us, and, the difference between, and I suppose what I'm going to go into today is like, it's not really a difference, it's kind of where inflammation comes from, and we get different types of inflammation in the body when it comes to an injury or when it comes to food ingestion, and what is actually going on in the body when inflammation happens. So first of all, let me clear up that not all inflammation in the body is bad. The majority of the time, it's there for a very important reason. So let's talk about an injury for a second. If you damage a joint, a knee, a hip, a shoulder, you get inflammation into that area. Now, a lot of the times, if you go to the doctor, they'll prescribe anti-inflammatories to reduce the inflammation. Now, this, to me, is a bad idea. And I know this is going to be controversial for a lot of people out there. Be like, what the fuck? Why are you saying that? Well, hear me out. The inflammation that is going into a joint is there to do a couple of things. Number one, if you pump a lot of fluid into a joint, you restrict the movement. Now, if you've injured a joint, let's use the knee, for example. If you've injured that, like torn a meniscus or an ACL or something like that, we want less movement of that joint to allow it to heal. Now, the body's natural response in order to restrict that movement is to pump that area full of fluid. That's naturally going to restrict the movement. Now, also, what's happening with that fluid that's getting pumped into that area is it's sending in a healing soup. Simple as. So that all those juices and fluids that are pumping into that area of injury are fluids that are going to help the healing process. They contain different, white blood cell proteins and whatnot that will help the healing process. That's why when you get a cut on your arm, you can build up a little bit of a scab on it, and sometimes if the scab comes off, it starts to weep. That juice that's coming out of it is a healing juice, a healing soup. So understand that not all inflammation is bad. That's why I'm hugely against, if someone gets an injury, then if they're prescribed anti-inflammatories, to not take them. And the reason is, the reason why that anti-inflammatory, or the reason why that inflammation is there in the first place, is to prevent movement and to help the healing process. It will drain out in its own time. Okay? So that's understanding the inflammatory response from an injury. Now let's understand the inflammatory response from food. You will have an inflammatory response from most foods, in some way, shape or form. Some foods you will eat will have a bigger inflammatory response than others, and some will have less. The ones you have a bigger inflammatory response from will be foods that contain more refined sugars. They're more heavily processed. Some of those trans fats and saturated fats that you get in food. So think of it this way. The more handling a food has before it gets to your plate, the more likely it's going to cause you some sort of an inflammatory response. Now, understand this, that you can eat certain foods that are a little bit harder to digest. For example, certain proteins. When I prescribe someone, calorie target, I always advise them to eat more protein. The reason why I want them to eat more protein is because it's harder for the body to break down, It raises the thermogenic effect. It will also have a higher inflammatory effect as well on the body. Therefore, the body is actually working harder to process it, burning more calories, but that's not a bad thing. That inflammatory response, that body working harder, is not a bad thing. It's just a process that the body goes through. It's why we train. We go to the gym to stress our bodies out, to actually do damage to our body. And in doing this damage and in having this stress on the body, it basically, you evolve. You adaptate. What's the word I'm trying to use? You adapt. Your body gets stressed and it has an adaptation. There you go. That's the fucking word I wanted to use. That's what's happening. That's what's happening. Now, you got to understand this, that there is certain foods out there, there's certain foods that you will eat that will create a higher level of inflammation and discomfort in your body. And there's a couple of ways you can deal with this. One, you can start to figure out what foods it is that creates this harsher effect. And you can somewhat start to not necessarily eliminate, but eat less. Listen, the way I put it to a friend there earlier on was, we all hang around with people, and we all have that one friend that's fucking a little bit more annoying than others. Now, and you know that you necessarily don't want to hang out with this cunt on your own because you know he's going to fucking wreck your head. Well, that's like foods. If you eat these foods on their own, they're going to fucking wreck your guts. Now, a better way to handle that friend is either one, hang out with them less, or two, hang out with that friend with more people around. So have more friends involved. So it spreads the fucking pissed offness. It's the same with food. If there's a particular food that really irritates your guts and creates a lot of inflammation, you have it with more foods. So you're spreading a more balance, and you're not getting fucking whacked with a huge amount of the same shit. Does that make sense? Good, I'm glad. So yeah, there's definitely a certain amount of foods that will cause more irritation. But as I said, understand this, that a certain amount of stress in the body is important to create an adaptation. Now, if we decide that a certain food that we eat for the first time or figure out that it's really upsetting us, well, then just eliminating it completely can sometimes create an intolerance to that food. Now, I definitely understand that certain foods that fuck people up, and there's certain gut conditions that people can't tolerate lactose or gluten. That's cool. But we can also create these problems if we completely eliminate certain foods and stay away from them for long periods of time, then try and reintroduce them, then we get an even more adverse response. What I always say when it comes to dieting and nutrition is, think back to when you were a kid. What were the foods and the main foods you consumed when you were young? Because that will be how your gut has developed now. And it'll be what your body can basically accommodate now more than anything else. Today we're in a world like food evolves, and the way it is produced constantly changes. I grew up in a farm back in Ireland where the meat that was in our freezer was the animals that were killed on the farm. The spuds on the table were grown in the backyard. The cabbage, the lettuce, the tomatoes. We didn't grow tomatoes. The onions. What was the other ones? The turnips and the beetroot. They were all grown out the back. And carrots and parsnips as well. All grown out the back. So that food is what I consumed. We had a huge amount of butter, natural butter. I drank a huge amount of milk. People see my Instagram and Facebook stories now, and they're like, how do you fucking drink so much milk? Because I've done it all my life. And I haven't eliminated it. Now, if I eliminated milk now for a couple of months, I'm damn sure that I'd have issues drinking it again. Sometimes when I buy a different brand of milk, I get a dose of the squirts for a day or two. But once I persist with it, then my gut starts to tolerate it. So understand that no matter what you do, training, nutrition, fucking lifestyle, if you put yourself in an adverse situation, you can adapt to it. Maybe you adapt quicker, maybe it's going to take longer, but it's about challenging. Okay? Understand that not all inflammation is bad. It's just a body's natural response, a chemical reaction. With inflammation, you get heat, and heat is a way of basically protecting the body or killing something in the body. But not everything needs to be killed. It's just the body's way of understanding that this isn't actually poison. This is something that we can use. But initially, getting used to a new foods or figuring out if a food works for you, depending on your response or your inflammatory response, is how you gauge how much of the food you should eat, and maybe you should eat that food along with other foods. So the long and short of it is, have a balanced diet. Remember how you used to eat as a kid, and this will steer you in the direction of the foods and the nutrition you should follow right now. Do your best to source food as clean and as healthy as possible, but understand that, you know, the way most food is produced nowadays, even if it says it's organic, is it fucking really organic? So it's about you just trying, seeing how it works for you, and then taking the next step and just make a smart decision on it. Not everything is going to fuck you up forever, and stress sometimes on the body is a very, very important thing. I hope that explains it a little bit. If you think I've missed something on that, please pop it in the comments below. And have a great day. Giddy up!